be independent and as impartial as reasonably possible. All available evidence must be collected, preserved and presented to the inquest court, including all potential witnesses must be interviewed, their statements obtained, and they must be made available to the court. There must be a very thorough scene of crime investigation. A thorough and impartial post-mortem should also be held. All relevant material must be made available to the inquest court.
Thanks, sir.
Notes on the independence and impartiality of the investigation, and although in 1971 it would have been challenging for the South African police to have selected a truly impartial investigator, however, they could have taken steps to try and achieve this. They could have brought in an investigator who had built up a credibility and a reputation for fair investigations from a different part of the country possibly, and an investigator who had a proven track record. The South African police at that time had many very qualified investigators who could have conducted an investigation like this. Although this wasn't done at the time in 1971 in South Africa, but since this investigation was important, not only because Timol was an important prisoner, but also because of the repressive laws that existed in South Africa, and particularly the detention without trial, that when a detainee died in custody, it put the government and the country under a lot of pressure from international organizations, from other nations. It also persuaded anti-apartheid people to enhance their resistance. So if the South African police wanted to demonstrate to everybody that this was indeed a suicide and not a killing or through torture or any other means, then they should have sought an impartial investigation. And to do that, they could have selected for example, a credible independent lawyer to act as an observer to the investigator. They could have brought in an international police officer to act as an observer. They didn't do that, and instead they appointed General Bass, who headed the detective branch at Pretoria headquarters. And General Bass very quickly demonstrated that he was in fact not impartial, because he made a report to the Report newspaper that he believed that Timol had committed suicide, and this was right at the beginning of the investigation, a conclusion he should not have reached at that stage.
And what impression would that have left in the minds of the wider public?
Well, the impression it would have left, and which I think it did leave, is that the investigation wasn't impartial.
Just turning to the question of taking statements from security branch members, you say that they only took statements of security branch members who were directly involved in one or another way with Mr. Timol. What should they have done?
Well, that's rather like if you have a death in the bedroom of a house, and the only people you talk to are the people in the bedroom and not in the people in the other parts of the house. So in this case, they should have spoken to everybody on the 10th floor. And they should even have made a chart, what each person was doing and where they were on each of the 5 days that Timol was in detention. They should have asked them what they heard, whether they heard screaming. They should have asked them, had they seen anything unusual? Had they seen a man with a blindfold walking down the corridor? Did they see a man that had to be supported because he couldn't walk properly? Have they seen any torture apparatus? All these questions should have been asked of everybody on the 10th floor, at least on the 10th floor.
And what he said, surprising that no black police members featured in the investigation.
I know that, I don't know the exact number, but I know that there was a large contingent of black members that worked on the 10th floor who were attached to the security branch. And it's surprising that none of them made a statement. None of them were approached for their view or for what they knew about the death of Arnold Timol.
You make reference to the police version dealing with a Mr. X. And according to the police version, accepted by the original inquest court,
Yes.
was that once Mr. X came into room 1026, where Timol was present, and announced that he knew where Quinton and Henry Jacobson were, that apparent or alleged startling news prompted Mr. Timol to exit the building through the window and commit suicide.
Yes.
So you raise a number of questions which I think are disturbing ones. And can you take the court through the questions that arose in your mind in relation to this Mr. X?
Well, Mr. X was obviously a very critical witness, if that version was true. And a statement should have been recorded from him, and he should have been made available to the inquest court. No statement was taken from him. He didn't appear before the inquest court on the basis that it wasn't in the interest of state security for him to appear. Now, this is surprising because at that time, and right through the 1980s, the security police made use of secret witnesses in court. And these witnesses would give evidence in camera, or they would give evidence in various ways so that their identities wouldn't be revealed. Mr. X could similarly have given evidence at the Timol inquest, and it surprises me that he didn't.
One very point. There hasn't been any law at that time which protected witnesses such as Mr. X from making statements or being identified. Was there, to your knowledge, any law or police regulation or police
Not that I'm aware of, my lord.
As the court pleases.
Can I comment further?
Yes, please do so.
The other surprising thing about Mr. X, if he was such a secret witness, if he was, for example, an undercover agent that had infiltrated a community or an organization, then it's completely illogical that he should go up to the 10th floor where there were numerous detainees being held and go to the door, go into the office where Timol was being held and make this announcement. Because it would just mean that at a later stage, Timol could have disclosed that Mr. X was a security branch agent. Any one of the other detainees who happened to see Mr. X could also have disclosed his role. Now, undercover agents are used in police forces throughout the world, but an undercover agent never goes to a police building or to a police office because of the danger of it blowing his cover.
So, what conclusions do you draw from this scenario?
Well, I wonder whether Mr. X actually existed.
Indeed, in your affidavit, you go so far as to say that the Mr. X version is a concoction devised by the police to explain the suicide of Mr. Timol.
Yes, exactly.
And investigating the wider scene, what do you think the police ought to have done? And when I mean the wider scene, around the building, perhaps.
Well, the investigation shouldn't have been restricted to the 10th floor. It should have been widened to the entire John Foster Square. There may have been people, policemen or visitors to the police station standing in the grounds that might have seen the fall. There may have been people, as we heard, for example, with Advocate Mattis, who happened to see the body falling when he looked out the window. So there ought to have been office-to-office inquiries done at John Foster Square to see whether anybody had any information that could assist the investigation.
And what about simply walking across the road from the impact zone to ask people in shops and filling stations and others,
Yes.
given that it was during the daytime, anybody might have heard or seen something?
Yes, exactly. And that ought to have been done. You know, appeals could have been put out to the public to come forward with information if anybody had seen anything significant. Nothing like that was done.
I mean, isn't that the most basic, elementary, 101 of investigations, that you do reach out and you do start talking to people in the vicinity?
If you want an investigation with an accurate result, you have to reach out to people. And the wider your reach, the better your result.
Let's turn to the scene of crime or incident investigation. What would be the most important sites of a crime scene investigation in this case?
Well, apart from the body, which I won't discuss because that is the post-mortem examination, but certainly there were 3 crime scenes. One is the place where Timol actually fell, the place his body or his person came to rest on the ground. The second is the office where he was held and from where he allegedly jumped, at office 1026. And then at least of the John Foster Square police station, the 10th floor. So then I discuss where the body came to rest. Now, factually what happened was that Timol's body was removed within minutes from him falling. If there were compelling reasons to move Mr. Timol, the position of his body ought to have been marked, either using paint or using tape or using rope or something. It's a very common thing that we all see on TV. You have a body lying on the carpet, taped out.
And it may seem obvious, but why would the police want to mark the position of the body?
Well, because you want to preserve the scene as best as you possibly can. And if there was a compelling reason to remove the body, you would want to record where the body was for your scene of crime investigation. The scene of crime investigation is where one gets your best evidence in terms of forensic evidence, which is more reliable than oral evidence.
And what else should have happened at the crime scene?
The crime scene, a plan ought to have been drawn of where the body lay and measurements taken between key points so that later, even 46 years later, you could reconstruct that scene exactly.
And what about...
Sorry? So, and then, of course, the scene should have been photographed. And properly and thoroughly photographed. Not 2 or 3 photographs, hundreds of photographs. every aspect of the scene should have been photographed.
While the body lay there.
While the body lay there, yes.
And
that again is, it's easy to reconstruct the scene from photographic evidence, where, for example, a shoe may have laid, or where a wristwatch fell, or any other aspect. The branches of the shrub that apparently were stripped. All these things should have been properly and carefully photographed.
But what if it happened perhaps in the late afternoon? We know that the police say he fell at around 3:50 p.m. Nightfall was approaching. I think that is probably disputable. But let's assume that it was close to nighttime. Is that a good excuse not to photograph?
No, it isn't. The South African police in 1971 were in possession of floodlights. They could have floodlit the area for photographs. And obviously, flash photography was in use in 1971. So the other alternative is you could have kept the scene exactly as it was until morning. And that is often the case that one does.
You mentioned something from Brigadier Patel's evidence. He spoke of an indentation in the earth, which indicated to him where Mr. Timol had fallen. What do you say should have been done in respect of that indentation?
Yes. Brigadier St. John Patel testified that he didn't see the body in sight, but that he had found an indentation on the ground which indicated to him where the body lay. Now that indentation should have been examined forensically so that it could be reproduced, the depth of it, so experts could be called in later on to examine the indentation and the hardness of the earth, to determine whether that indentation was made by a body falling, rather than maybe somebody scratching out the indentation.
So the depth and position should have been measured.
Yes, very important.
And you also
have indicated the position in which the body fell.
In the absence of tape measures and photographs. You also mentioned that certain steps should have been taken in relation to blood stain on the earth.
Yes, I understand that Mr. Timol bled while then after the fall. I think it would have been important for samples to have been taken of that blood and for it to have been compared to the blood of Mr. Timol. At that time, they didn't have DNA technology, but they could do blood grouping. And that would have assisted one to come to a conclusion, a strong conclusion, that the body that was in the mortuary, the person identified as Mr. Timol, did actually fall in that position.
You also make mention of the position of windows in the building itself. Why was this important?
Well, the position of windows, whether they were open or closed. Advocate Mattis testified, for example, that he looked up and he saw that the windows were all closed. If that is in fact the case, then Mr. Timol couldn't have exited from a window. And conversely, if there were open windows or a open window, it would support the case that he did exit from a window.
And also, if the position of windows in the building had been recorded, we get a better idea as to whether Mr. Timol might have bumped into or hit one or more windows.
Exactly.
Coming back to photography, you've spoken about the crime scene itself, but your statement says that there should have been more photographs taken of the surroundings. Why is that?
Well, there should have been photographs of the surroundings. I've mentioned the shrubs. There should be of the wall, if there was any wall, how close the traffic was from the road, was from where the body lay. Photographs of open windows. So just generally anything of interest, and not only of interest, to record those photographs. So if, for example, now 46 years later, we want to see if there was an open window or something protruding against which Mr. Timol could have fallen, we could examine that photograph and find out very clearly what the position was.
And why do you say an expert on trajectory of the fall should have been secured?
Well, that is also very important in a suicide case where there might be doubt as to whether it was in fact suicide or he might have been pushed, to find out how far he landed from the building and whether that trajectory, according to an expert, is where he would have likely have fallen. The only position that I know of in this particular case is Brigadier Patel, who said the body lay 10 feet from the building. And he also observed damage to the shrubbery. So it may be that the police, needing to account for injuries to Mr. Timol, needed him to fall through the shrub. And a trajectory expert would be able to say whether it was feasible, whether he could have fallen through the shrub.
Let's turn to room 1026, the so-called second crime scene. And can you take us through, and this is at page 24 of your affidavit.
Yes, again, photographs and plans should have been properly drawn and prepared of every aspect of the office, including windows, position of telephones, position of filing cabinets, positions of waste paper baskets. Everything should have been recorded. The office should have been forensically examined for fingerprints and blood stains. I know that Brigadier Patel says that he did an inspection for blood stains. That's not sufficient. A forensic expert needs to look for blood stains, because there's a possibility that if there were blood stains, they might have been cleaned, and a layman wouldn't see those blood stains. The forensic expert would be able to find them. The office should have been searched for items such as food, food wrappers, drinks and containers, drink containers and clothing. Any recovered clothing that might have belonged to Timol should have been forensically examined for blood stains, for body fluids. That should have been examined for signs of violence, tears and rips. The contents of the waste paper bin ought to have been very carefully checked. Timol was sitting at the desk, and according to the evidence, he was busy writing statements. He could have written a suicide note and dropped it into the waste paper bin. But we don't know whether anybody checked that. The phone number and the last numbers it dialed, I can't remember in 1971 whether the telephones had recall capacities. I think they did. But in any event, assuming that they did, those numbers should have been recorded and investigated. The window through which Mr. Timol jumped ought to have been forensically examined for fingerprints, blood, and traces of shoe polish and mud. If he went through that window, Mr. Timol would have left forensic traces of him leaving that window. Those examinations weren't done. The precise position that the investigators found the window in should have been recorded. Was it fully open? Was it closed? Was it halfway open? Was the latch tightened? How easily did the closing and opening mechanism work? and all these aspects should have been noted.
And you have made reference to the 10th floor, but just take us through the more specific investigations that should have happened on that 10th floor.
Well, an inspection should have been held of the entire 10th floor, looking for any unusual or suspicious item. There could be torture apparatus, electric shocking machines. There could have been bags, hoods for a person's face. There could have been blindfolds, and all these things should have been looked for. Mr. Timol was held on that floor for almost 5 days. I think it was 4 hours and 17 minutes. Evidence of his presence and the nature of his detention should have been closely examined on that floor.